If you were to open a forgotten archive of 19th century photographs, the kind that smell faintly of dust and chemicals, the kind that capture moments long before our time, you might expect to see familiar scenes: families standing stiffly in front of wooden homes, soldiers lined in quiet formation, workers posing beside the tools of their trade. And yet, hidden within some of these images, there is something that doesn't quite belong, something that at first feels like a trick of perspective, until you look again. Figures that rise above everyone else, not by a small margin, but by an amount so striking it forces you to pause. Heads towering over crowds, limbs longer than seems natural, bodies that appear both proportionate and impossibly large. These are not blurry distortions or crude manipulations. These are photographs from a time when altering an image required painstaking effort, when cameras were valued for their ability to capture reality as it was. And yet here they are, people who, by every visual measure, should not exist in the way they appear. At first, it's easy to dismiss them. Perhaps they were simply rare individuals, cases of unusual height caused by known medical conditions. After all, history does record people who grew far beyond the average. But as more images surface, from different countries, different decades, different contexts, the explanation begins to feel less complete. Because these figures are not isolated to one place or one moment. They appear again and again, sometimes standing beside ordinary citizens, sometimes integrated into groups where no one seems particularly surprised by their presence. And that is where the discomfort begins, not in the existence of one giant, but in the quiet suggestion that they may not have been as rare as we assume. As the photographs multiply, so do the questions. Because these individuals are not always hidden at the edges of society, in some cases, they are placed front and center, standing among soldiers in uniform, appearing in formal portraits, even participating in public events. Old newspaper clippings and posters occasionally mention giants, often presented as curiosities, performers, or medical wonders. Names surface briefly, attached to exaggerated measurements and dramatic descriptions, only to disappear just as quickly from the record. There are accounts of men who stood over 7 feet tall, sometimes even taller, traveling with exhibitions or working in environments where their height made them both visible and valuable. And yet, despite this visibility, their stories rarely go beyond surface detail. We are told how tall they were, sometimes where they came from, but rarely who they truly were, how they lived, or what became of them. Medical journals from the era attempt to explain such cases through conditions like gigantism, describing abnormalities in growth hormones, skeletal development, and internal complications. But something about the photographs complicates that narrative. Many of these individuals do not appear distorted or fragile. They stand upright, proportionate, composed. Their limbs align naturally with their bodies. Their posture suggests strength rather than strain. And that raises an uncomfortable thought. If these were purely medical anomalies, why do so many of them appear physically balanced, almost as if their size was not a disorder, but simply a variation? The deeper one looks, the more patterns begin to emerge, patterns that are difficult to explain away as coincidence. Across unrelated photographs, taken in different regions and by different photographers, there are similarities that feel almost deliberate, heights that seem to fall within a certain range, bodies that maintain proportion rather than irregularity, expressions that reveal neither discomfort nor spectacle, but something closer to normalcy. In some images, these towering figures are surrounded by others who appear completely at ease, as if standing beside someone significantly taller was not an extraordinary event. There are group photos where one or two individuals rise above the rest, yet no visual emphasis is placed on them. No indication that the moment was meant to highlight their difference. It is as though they were simply part of the scene. And then there are the environments themselves. Military units, schools, work crews, structured settings where individuals are organized, documented, and accounted for. The presence of unusually tall individuals in such environments suggests a level of integration that goes beyond rarity. It hints at the possibility that they were not just passing curiosities, but participants in everyday life. And if that is the case, then another question quietly forms beneath the surface. How many were there? Really, by the time we reach the early 20th century, something changes. The mentions become less frequent. The photographs, once scattered but persistent, begin to thin out. The stories of giants, once whispered through newspapers and public exhibitions, fade into near silence. Modern records still acknowledge rare cases of extreme height, but they are framed differently, carefully categorized, medically explained, isolated. The idea of giants as a visible presence in society seems to vanish, replaced by clinical terminology and statistical rarity. And this is where interpretations begin to diverge. The most widely accepted explanation remains grounded in science. These individuals, it is said, were simply rare cases of hormonal imbalance, their unusual height the result of specific medical conditions that are now better understood and documented. Advances in medicine have allowed us to identify, classify, and explain such cases with greater precision, removing the mystery and placing them firmly within the realm of biology. But not everyone finds this explanation satisfying. Some observers point to the consistency in older photographs, the apparent normalcy of proportions, the repeated presence across different contexts, and suggest that something may be missing from the official narrative. Could there have been environmental factors, lost over time, that influenced human growth in ways we no longer experience? Could these individuals represent a variation that once existed more prominently, only to disappear as conditions changed? Or, more controversially, could their existence have conflicted with emerging scientific frameworks, leading to their gradual reclassification, reinterpretation, or quiet omission? There are even those who go further, proposing ideas that sit on the edge of speculation, that these figures were remnants of an earlier population, traces of a human variation that once coexisted with what we now consider standard. That history, in its attempt to organize and simplify the past, may have smoothed over details that did not fit neatly into evolving narratives. It is said that records can be lost, altered, or forgotten, not always through deliberate action, but through the natural process of time, where certain stories are preserved and others fade into obscurity. And yet, when looking at these photographs, when noticing the repetition, the familiarity, the subtle suggestion that these individuals were not entirely out of place, it becomes difficult to ignore the possibility that something more complex may have once existed. Something that, for reasons we may never fully understand, is no longer visible in the world we know today. In the end, what remains is not a definitive answer, but a quiet absence. The photographs still exist, scattered across archives, collections, and forgotten albums, each one offering a glimpse into a moment that feels both real and strangely out of reach. The records, incomplete and fragmented, hint at stories that were never fully told, and the giants themselves, whether rare individuals shaped by biology or something more elusive, have left behind little more than images and questions. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this mystery is not the possibility that giants once walked among us, but the realization of how easily something so visible could slip into obscurity. Because if entire lives, entire patterns of existence, can fade so completely from common memory, then it raises a deeper question, not just about the past, but about the nature of history itself. What else might have been seen, documented, even understood in its own time, only to be gradually forgotten, dismissed, or redefined until it no longer resembles its original form? And if traces of those forgotten realities still linger, hidden in plain sight within old photographs and overlooked records, then perhaps the real mystery is not why they vanished, but whether we ever truly understood them to begin with. And if we follow that thought just a little further, it begins to shift how we see not only those photographs, but the entire structure of recorded history. Because history, despite its authority, is not a perfect mirror of reality. It is a collection of what was preserved, what was prioritized, and sometimes, what was simplified so it could be understood more easily by future generations. Details that don't fit established frameworks have a tendency to be reinterpreted, reduced, or quietly set aside, not necessarily out of malice, but out of necessity, convenience, or even disbelief. And so, When we look back at those towering figures captured in fragile glass plates and fading prints, we are not just looking at anomalies. We are looking at fragments of a reality that may not have fully survived the process of being remembered. It is possible that the truth is far less extraordinary than it feels, that these individuals were simply rare, their presence exaggerated by the limitations of early documentation, their stories lost because no one thought to preserve them in detail, that what we see as a pattern is nothing more than coincidence, stitched together by our natural desire to find meaning in the unexplained. But it is equally possible that what we are sensing, that quiet discomfort, that lingering sense that something doesn't quite add up, is rooted in something real. Not necessarily a hidden civilization or a forgotten race, but perhaps a version of humanity that existed in a slightly different form than we are accustomed to today. A variation that, over time, became less common, less visible, until it eventually disappeared from everyday life altogether. And this is where the mystery becomes something more personal, something that reaches beyond the photographs themselves, because it forces us to confront a simple but unsettling idea that our understanding of the past is always incomplete, that there are layers of reality that may have existed just beneath the surface of recorded history, glimpsed briefly, documented imperfectly, and then slowly lost as the world changed. The giants, whether they were rare individuals or something more widespread, become symbols of that gap, a reminder that even in an age of documentation, even in a time when cameras were beginning to capture the world with unprecedented clarity, not everything was fully understood, and not everything was carried forward. So the next time you see one of those images, a towering figure standing calmly among others, not exaggerated, not distorted, but simply there, existing in a moment that feels both ordinary and impossible, it may be worth pausing for just a second longer. Not to jump to conclusions, not to force an explanation, but simply to acknowledge the question itself. Because sometimes the value of a mystery is not in solving it, but in recognizing that it exists, in allowing it to challenge what we think we know, to open the door, even slightly, to the possibility that the past was more complex, more varied, and perhaps more surprising than we have been led to believe. And maybe, just maybe, those silent figures captured in 19th century photographs are not asking to be explained, but simply to be remembered. And in that act of remembering, something subtle begins to change. The photographs stop feeling like distant curiosities and start to feel more like fragments of a conversation that was never finished. Each image becomes less about proving something and more about pointing towards something that once was something that existed long enough to be captured, yet not long enough to be fully understood. The longer you sit with them, the more they seem to resist simple explanations. They don't behave like myths, because they are grounded in physical evidence. But they don't fit comfortably into modern understanding either, because they raise questions that remain unanswered. It's in the small details that the mystery deepens. The way shadows fall consistently across figures of dramatically different heights, suggesting no manipulation. The way clothing appears tailored, not improvised, as if these individuals were expected, accounted for. The way others in the photographs stand without visible reaction, their expressions neutral, their posture relaxed, as though nothing about the scene required explanation. These are not the reactions you would expect if something truly extraordinary had suddenly appeared. Instead, they hint at familiarity, at a reality where such differences were not entirely out of place. And then, there is the silence that follows. Because if something like this did exist, even in a limited capacity, its disappearance should have left a clearer trace. There should be debates, detailed studies, preserved narratives passed from one generation to the next. But instead, there is a gap, a thinning of references, a narrowing of explanations, until what remains is a simplified version of events that feels almost too clean. It is said that progress often brings clarity, that as knowledge expands, mysteries shrink. But sometimes, progress also brings reduction. Complex realities are compressed into manageable categories, unusual phenomena are labeled and contained, and anything that does not fit neatly within those categories risks being overlooked. Of course, none of this proves anything definitive. The past is not a puzzle with a single hidden answer waiting to be uncovered. It is more like a landscape seen through shifting layers of fog, where some shapes are clear, others are distorted, and some are barely visible at all. What we choose to focus on often determines what we believe we see. For some, these photographs will always represent nothing more than rare medical cases, interesting but ultimately explainable. For others, they will remain open questions, invitations to look a little closer, to question a little deeper, to consider the possibility that not everything has been fully accounted for. And perhaps that is where the true power of this mystery lies. Not in confirming the existence of giants as something extraordinary, but in revealing how fragile our understanding of history can be, how easily details can fade, how quickly narratives can shift, how quietly entire aspects of reality can move from common knowledge into obscurity. The giants, whether they were many or few, whether they were misunderstood or simply forgotten, become part of that larger pattern. A reminder that the past is not fixed, that it is shaped not only by what happened, but by what was remembered, recorded, and repeated. So, as we close this story, there is no final revelation waiting at the end, no single explanation that ties everything together neatly. Instead, there is only the image itself, a moment frozen in time, a figure standing just a little too tall, just a little too different, yet undeniably real within the frame. And the question it leaves behind is not one that demands an immediate answer, but one that lingers quietly in the background, waiting to be considered. Because if something so visible could slip so completely into the margins of history, then what else might still be there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice? And perhaps the most unsettling part is how easily we move past it. In a world overflowing with images, information, and constant distraction, even the strangest details can be reduced to a brief moment of curiosity before being forgotten again. A photograph is seen, questioned for a second, then dismissed with a quick explanation, filed away in the mind as something already understood. But what if that instinct to explain quickly, to move on, has quietly shaped the way we interpret the past? What if, over time, that habit has caused us to overlook patterns that didn't fit neatly into what we expected to find? Because when you return to those images, slowly, without rushing to conclusions, something begins to shift. The figures don't feel exaggerated, they don't feel like illusions, they feel present, grounded, real, in the same way everything else in the frame is real. And that consistency is difficult to ignore. It doesn't demand belief, but it resists dismissal. It lingers in that uncertain space between explanation and doubt, where questions remain open, not because they are unsolvable, but because they haven't been fully explored. It's possible that future discoveries, new analyses, or forgotten archives may one day offer clearer answers. That somewhere, in a place yet to be examined, there are records that connect the fragments, that explain why these individuals appeared when they did, and why they seemed to disappear. But until then, all we have are the traces that remain. The photographs, the scattered mentions, the subtle patterns that hint at something just beyond full understanding. And maybe that's enough. Because not every mystery needs to be resolved to have meaning. Some exist to remind us that the world, both past and present, is far more layered than it appears on the surface. That certainty, while comforting, is not always complete. And that history, for all its structure and authority, still holds spaces where questions outnumber answers. So the next time you come across one of those silent images from the 19th century, where a figure stands just a little too tall among others who seem entirely ordinary, you may find yourself looking at it differently. Not searching immediately for what's wrong with it, but wondering instead, what if nothing is wrong at all? What if what you're seeing is exactly what was there, captured without intention, preserved without explanation, and carried quietly through time until it reached you? And if that's the case, then the mystery isn't just about giants. It's about how much of reality can exist and still be forgotten. And once that idea settles in, it becomes difficult to look at history the same way again, because the question quietly expands beyond those photographs, beyond the figures themselves, into something far broader. If even a small part of our past can fade this completely, leaving behind only scattered traces and unanswered questions, then how much of what we accept as complete is actually just partial? We tend to think of history as something solid, something carefully built from evidence and preserved with accuracy. But in reality, it is more like a structure constantly being reshaped. New discoveries add to it, interpretations refine it, and over time, certain details are emphasized while others quietly fall away. Not everything is lost dramatically. Sometimes it disappears slowly, almost invisibly, as attention shifts elsewhere. And when that happens, what remains is not necessarily false, but it may no longer be complete. The giants, if we can even call them that with certainty, seem to exist right at the edge of that process. Visible enough to be recorded, but not consistently enough to be fully integrated into the larger narrative. A presence that was acknowledged, but never deeply explored. And then, gradually, no longer acknowledged at all. Not because they were proven impossible, but because they became unnecessary to explain. The world moved forward, and whatever space they once occupied in common awareness simply closed around them. There is something strangely human about that. The way we prioritize what feels relevant, the way we simplify what feels complex, the way we let go of details that don't immediately serve our understanding of the present. It's not a flaw, exactly, more like a function of how we make sense of an overwhelming amount of information. But it does come with a cost, because every simplification carries the risk of leaving something behind. And so, what we're left with is not just a mystery about unusual figures in old photographs, but a reflection of how easily reality itself can become fragmented, how something can exist fully in one moment, be documented clearly enough to survive, and yet still slip into a kind of historical silence, not erased in a dramatic sense, but softened, reduced, and eventually overlooked. Maybe the giants were exactly what modern explanations suggest: rare individuals whose stories simply weren't preserved in detail. Or maybe they were part of a broader variation that no longer exists in the same way. Or maybe the truth lies somewhere in between, in a space where multiple explanations overlap, none of them entirely complete on their own. We may never know for certain, and perhaps that uncertainty is the most honest conclusion we can reach. Because in the end, the photographs don't argue. They don't explain themselves. They simply remain. Quiet, patient, unchanged, waiting for each new set of eyes to notice what previous ones may have overlooked. And in that silence, they continue to do what they have always done, not by telling us what to think, but by reminding us how much there still is to question. And if there is one thing that lingers after all of this, one thought that stays with you long after the images fade from view, it is this: that the past may not be as distant as it seems. Not because it is hidden, but because parts of it are still here, preserved in small, overlooked details, waiting for someone to take a closer look. Because sometimes, the most important things are not the ones that were never seen, but the ones that were seen, and then slowly forgotten.